Okay, so this presentation is going to be a little bit different to what I had originally planned in the interest of time. So I just want to make once an apology right up front for all of those that aren't interested in maths and statistics. I'm afraid this might be a little bit boring. But please stay with me. And I want to also say up front, if any of you are particularly interested in this and would like to support us in terms of feeding into some consultation around weightings, etc., can you please email either myself or Eric as well, because we were going to try and take some consultation in this session, but we won't have time for that. So if you are interested, please do email us. We would like to get as much feedback as we possibly can. So firstly, I have been tasked with others by UNESCO to try and come up with an instrument, well, not an instrument so much, but a specific index, a single index, out of a series of composite indicators or items that had been previously identified. So a few years ago, back in 2010, UNESCO first proposed this instrument and then undertook quite extensive consultation with experts across the field back then, and then came up with essentially 20 items, 20 specific indicators. It is now the task to bring those 20 indicators together as a single index, and so that's partly a mathematical problem, and it's partly a empirical question around potentially some items might be more important, or indicators might be more important than others, and that can be tested empirically, but it also can be undertaken through consultation as well as. So we'd like to do a little bit of both. So this presentation is really just trying to explain a little bit what work has been done before, and then the process that we're going through to try and bring a composite indicator together. So this is not my work as such, this is the work that UNESCO has previously done. So this is the conceptual model. I think most of you would be familiar with the classic Bronfenbrenner type of a model with different layers and the different aspects of holistic early child development that are captured. There's quite a comprehensive report, if anybody's interested, that you can download as well. I know you're not going to be able to read these, so I have split them into separate slides, but there are 4 main targets, which is essentially sort of survival and age-appropriate development and learning, cognitive, stimulating, emotionally supportive home environments and adequate resources, and then 1 around sort of families and services and support to children, and then the last being children's rights. Within each of those 4 targets, there are sub-targets, and it's these sub-targets that we will want to weight in terms of degrees of importance, right? So you might suggest that survival is probably the most important aspect, and you may want to weight that higher in a composite score than something like frequent illness. Clearly, frequent illness is still an issue, but death is probably the biggest issue, right? So you might want to weight them differently, and that's the sort of feedback and consultation we would like to gain from you and others. So these are the sub-targets. Again, in the interest of time, I'm not going to read through all of these. They are available online, and I think all the presentations will be available, so you can go through them yourself. Cognitive stimulating. So this is really around home environment and resources. And then the last one being child rights. So then I'm just going to briefly talk about how to bring these together, and this is the maths component of coming up with a single index. So ideally you would have a single index that would range from 0 to 1, 0 being the worst possible outcome and 1 being the best, right? You would also be able to undertake this at, say, a regional level or a country level. You could use the instrument to compare countries, you could use it to compare different regions within your country, you could even take it down to an individual level. So in terms of the steps that we've gone through so far, each of those individual 20 indicators ideally would also get a score of 0 to 1. Now for some of you, you might remember that those indicators do not all range between 0 and 1, right? So infant mortality rate is not generally reported as something between 0 and 1, right? So each of these different indicators have a different magnitude of range, and so you can't just sort of add them up, right? Because it doesn't make sense. So each one of these composites has to get a score of 0 to 1, and there's a process of doing that, right? So ideally, you want to turn them into a percent, or I won't get into the argument between percent and proportion, but into basically a percent probability weight, essentially, what we're doing here. So instead of reporting it as you would normally do, you just do something like percentage of children that die before the age of 5, divide it by 100 and get a percent, right? Turn it into an item of 0 to 1. That then allows you to add all of the different items together, right? So essentially, each one of these 20 targets gets a score of 0 to 1. Now then there's the question of how you add them together. In the majority of indicators, indexes that are used around the world, you just essentially add them all together and average them. Doing that actually means that you have a whole lot of aggregation around the mean score, right? So you might have, I don't know, top of my head, you might have 0.4 and 0.6 on two indicators, you bring them together, it gives you a 0.5, right? You might also have 0.3 and a 0.7 in a country. You aggregate them together, it also gives you a 0.5. Now one could argue that the second country is different from the first country, and you actually don't really want to give them both 0.5. Does that make sense? So there is a mathematical way of being able to combine the scores. Yeah, sorry, formulas, which is called the Euclidean distance from the ideal. So the ideal being 1, right? And so instead of doing the standard average, you do this fancy maths and you bring it all together, and it's a better way of sort of separating the middle out in particular, so you can have a better, a stronger score in terms of sort of discriminating, I suppose, countries or regions that are ranging in the middle. So again, for the statisticians, you might love this, but everybody else, you'll hate it, so that's fine. But hopefully you get the concept, yeah? All right, so after doing all of that, you may also want to weight. And this is actually the real challenge. The maths is sort of, to a certain extent, the easy component. The weighting is the hard component. And there have been indicators that have been severely critiqued in the literature for taking one pathway versus another pathway. The World Health Organization tends to take consultation as their way of being able to determine weights, but there are many that have critiqued the WHO, saying that you should actually be using empirical evidence to weight some items over other items. So far, this is an open debate that we're discussing and trying to come up with an answer. So that's where we would really like your feedback. So what we're suggesting is, for those of you that are interested, again, please email both myself and or Eric, and we'll add you to a group, and we will start to discuss those 20 targets and to maybe start thinking about ranking them in terms of priority. And for you as a country representing your country, what do you think is most important for child development in your country? So I'm going to leave it at that because I know we're really short for time, but please do email. So my email is sally.brinkman@adelaide.edu.au. You can just Google me, you'll find about 3 different email addresses. They'll all come to me, don't worry. And I think Eric's is online anyway as well. Okay, thank you.